In 2011, a friend of mine introduced me to a small video game. It was only in beta at the time, and far from the game it is today. The game was called Minecraft. One of his friends at the time, or a friend of a friend, was running an SMP server, and at the time I was introduced to the game and invited to the server. This was the only place I played the game. Not in creative mode or in my own survival world, only on this server. Unfortunately, that world has been lost in time, and the connection to the original owner was severed many years ago. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to get my hands on the original world files. I don't even know if they exist anymore. So I went on an archeological dig, so to speak, a quest. A quest to find anything I could, any traces of my world. My first build. Looking through some of my old drawers, I found a couple of external drives and a couple of pen drives I hadn't used in years. On an old hard drive, I found 2 in-game screenshots. Images of the construction of the first large-scale build I ever created, which was actually also the first build I ever made in the game. I say large-scale, but at the time the height limit was only 64 blocks above sea level. So what counted as large scale is dwarfed by the giant builds we see today. What you see here is the first of 2 screenshots of the build, the only 2 in-game images that has survived, and they are from about a month before the official release of Minecraft. There are a couple of things we can glean from this image. First, I was using an early version of the Sphax Pure resource pack. Second, there's a creeper! Ah! Third, I didn't use any stab blocks, because there weren't any, or at least not any sandstone stab blocks. There were a couple of others. Sandstone stairs were only introduced later in 2012, almost a year after. The limited scale you could build in and the limited block selection made detailing a difficult task when designing my first real build. And it's not the small watchtower you're seeing here. Actually, it's the sandstone blocks you can see here on the left. The second image is taken only 4 days later, and here's where it starts to get really interesting. You can see the main tower of what would become my first cathedral. And a couple of more things are revealed in this image. The blocks we saw on the left is now removed and placed on a similar foundation next to it. But why build the tower and move it? You see, an interesting thing happened in the update shortly after I started building. Before the update, the sun wasn't actually rising in the east, or what was referred to as east in-game, which meant that the sun wasn't actually rising behind the altar in the first version of the build after the update, which is usually how real-life churches are oriented. So I had to rotate it 90 degrees, and this was also confirmed by a map I found. I even overlaid a blueprint of the rest of the cathedral, as you can see here. And this is when I found something even better. A map of the finished build. And an isometric view of the cathedral and some of the builds I added in the month after. And even better than that, I found the original 3D model I made back then, with the exact same dimensions. And that's when I knew I really had to make this video. So for recreating the design, I decided to give the mod Axiom a try. In most of my time-lapse videos, I build manually, without any tools to help speed up the process. I use World Edit a lot for sketching and even used it for some of my earlier time-lapse videos. But Axiom is totally new to me, and I wanted to see what all the fuss is about. I will come back to this later in the video, because not only will I recreate the original build, I will also remake it. A new and updated version of the cathedral with all the knowledge and tools I have all these years later. When designing my first build, I wanted to create something that could work within the limitations of Minecraft and still look like something that could exist in real life. And I think to some extent I succeeded, especially with the main tower. But of course, if you look at the nave and flying buttresses, they kind of have to conform to the rigid structure of Minecraft, so the blocky nature definitely comes through. The church that inspired the initial idea wasn't in fact Helgrimskirke in Iceland, even though they're similar in multiple ways. It was actually Grundtvig's church in Copenhagen, designed by P.V. Jensen Klint. And the interior is, how can I put it, one of, if not the most beautiful room I've ever been in my entire life. In regards to my own build, it wasn't the design so much as the minimalist approach in shape and materials I was inspired by. And coming back all these years later and walking inside my first build ever really takes me back to those early years of Minecraft. Like thoughts I had at the time come back in waves. It's elusive, but the feeling is still there, clear as day. Before creating the new version of the build, I want to show you something. 10 years ago, back in 2015, God, has it been this long? Bloodborne was released 10 years ago, and we don't even have a sequel or PC port yet. Sorry for the tangent. 10 years ago, I actually created a remake of the original build, a much bigger version. This was still back in the old days, so it has all the charm of old school Minecraft with zero texturing, just pure shapes. You see, Danish architecture and design heavily favors minimalism, and it's no wonder that current generations of architects look back at early modernist architecture as the pinnacle of design and rationality. Form follows function was a phrase we heard again and again when studying to become architects. Le Corbusier, Arne Jacobsen, Utzon, all pioneers in their own way, for better and for worse. And that strain was closely linked with Klint's vision of Grundtvig's church when designing it in the early 20th century. And it's been a building that has been close to my heart all these years. My own journey as a Minecraft builder can be categorized in 3 eras. The first era, from 2011, adhering to ultra-minimalism. The second era of 2015, which was a continuation of the first one, but with the possibility of a much larger scale. And the third era, from around 2021 to now, the current era, where I've been exposed to other builders, where I've learned to incorporate a much wider array of blocks into my palette. Learning to texture and detail in a way I didn't even think of during the earlier years, but still traces of my old designs in shape and in the focus on minimalism in the color palette. So when settling on a design for the new version of the first cathedral, I didn't want to go the same direction I did for the second version of the build. I ultimately decided to recreate it in more of a Gothic revival style of architecture, or even Neo-Gothic style. The thing about my style of building is that I rarely recreate builds from real life. Like, I'm inspired by real buildings, but when it comes to detailing, I usually fall back to more basic design methods used in smaller Minecraft builds. I recently visited the Terra 1912 server, where the objective is to recreate real-life builds with every trick in the book. And they use tools like Axiom to manipulate block states for unconventional blocks like plants to recreate detail that wouldn't be possible in vanilla Minecraft. And the objective is to make the builds as realistic as possible while working in a one-to-one scale. But one of the drawbacks with this method is how messy it can look up close. This isn't really a flaw, it's just the reality of how detailing works in Minecraft. And I would argue that at least some of their builds are best appreciated when observed in their entirety. Where I differ in my approach is that I design everything like I would in smaller scale builds, where everything can be appreciated from up close, while still retaining a high level of detail. This is also the reason people can recreate my builds from tutorials in survival mode without using any additional tools. And I must stress, I'm not saying that one approach is better than the other. I strongly believe that there's room for a variety of styles like in any other creative medium. It all depends on what your goal is. So for instance, a Wes Anderson movie is different than a Tarantino movie in so many ways. But I'd imagine that one appreciates the other while still acknowledging that they would probably do it differently in the other's shoes. They make wonderful stuff over on the Terra 1912 server, and you can watch it all over at WBC Builds. Definitely worth a watch. Instead of following the minute details of real-life builds, I tend to use general shapes and proportions as references, and then come up with my own details that I find appealing in Minecraft. Looking closely, details like these are not really similar to what you see in real life. They don't really look like anything. They look like a collection of blocks and combination of blocks that we know from Minecraft itself. It's self-referential. It's a bit akin to brushstrokes in a painting in real life. Up close, it doesn't really look like the subject in the painting, but we know what it looks like because we know what brushstrokes are. That is my mission in Minecraft, to find the balance between real life and the design language of Minecraft itself. A creator on YouTube that is really good at striking the balance between realism and the limitations of Minecraft is Evia. She creates stunning builds. They are grand and beautiful without being overdone. I'm very inspired by her stuff, so definitely check out her channel. And now for the design of the remake of the first cathedral. I didn't want to stray too far from the block palette of the original build, so I tried a kind of a monochromatic palette with sandstone variants and an oak variants for the rooftops. The adherence I have to minimalism in block choice is present in most of my builds actually, and I kind of feel I have to force myself to branch out. But yeah, I kind of feel like having a specific approach, even when it comes to stuff like using fewer types of materials, I kind of feel it's something that is authentic to myself and kind of sets my builds apart from others. KXifer is worth mentioning here as a creator that in a similar vein as me works within the limitations of vanilla Minecraft and comes up with original designs while still following the architectural traditions closely. Where I lean more into fantasy, he leans more into history. And what an amazing job he's doing, truly. He's such a good storyteller, cinematographer and artist. He has a truly unique voice in this space, and if you want a more technical walkthrough of all the design elements he's using for his cathedral, his magnum opus, you should definitely watch his videos. He's much more educational in his narration of his design process than I am, and honestly inspires me to lean more into the vast landscape of architectural knowledge and history. For my own build here, I can say that I did lean more into references than usual. Rahn's Cathedral, I probably butchered the name. That was probably the biggest inspiration for the main towers. There was a phrase I remember hearing during a lecture when starting to become an architect, and I find it fitting for my experience building this kind of build. It goes something like this. At a certain point when designing a building, the creative process develops a will of its own. It kind of reminds me a bit of the Inception quote about the feeling of a building creating itself during the design process. Now in the movie that referred to genuine inspiration and that it feels like discovering the design. The one from the lecture was similar but referred to something a bit different, I think, or at least that was my interpretation of it. I think it referred to the fact that if you know the template of how something is designed, like a cathedral in this case, each step of the design process can feel like the building is creating itself because of the inherent rules the architectural tradition has bestowed upon us. I guess it's a bit like cooking a well-known dish. Even if you put your own spin on it and kind of make it your own, you can and probably will follow a long tradition of similar dishes. And whether you want to or not, you'll probably fall back on well-known tricks used for that particular dish. So for the tower here, I'm basically trying to get the proportions right. That's why I'm changing the height constantly. But I'm also using my knowledge of cathedrals in general to fill in the gaps. That is the quote-unquote recipe I'm following. Instead of recreating the trumpet-shaped apse of the original build, I took inspiration from the cathedral Ulm Münster and instead added the two minor towers on each side to counterbalance the main towers. Most parts of this build can be recreated in vanilla Minecraft, but I did rely on Axiom for a couple of things. So, as I mentioned before, Axiom can manipulate the block state of wall blocks in particular. But all sorts of blocks really. And it's really helpful for creating these rose windows, where you kind of need these angled parts. Shapes you can't necessarily make in vanilla Minecraft, unless you scale up the build a lot. It's amazing what you can do with this tool. For the apse itself, I went for a simpler design with only straight and 45-degree angle windows. And yeah, this is again because of my more rigid approach, where I tend to avoid too many angles in my designs. To keep the build in line with the original version, I went for a more subtle texturing. It's what I call leaking texture, which is basically what you see on the windows and the like. It's a controlled and an approachable way of texturing where you basically just add vertical gradients in different lengths or heights. And since the building isn't exposed to centuries of air pollution, because it isn't really standing in the middle of an industrial city, it wouldn't appear black like large cathedrals we see in big cities. Although that kind of project would be kind of incredible to build, right? Maybe for a future creation. Only a few things remained at this point. A floor pattern and some extra details are missed. The lighting was particularly important to get right. A crucial part of any cathedral in Minecraft, I would say. So, after a lot of contemplating, planning, lots of building and tinkering, I give you the first cathedral. In my pursuit of combining the more traditional way of building in Minecraft with real-life buildings, I've come to embrace a more loose interpretation, where I find room both literally and figuratively for in-game uses. Rooms you wouldn't really find in real cathedrals, but rooms that are extremely useful in a Minecraft playthrough, for instance. The roof construction is one of these places where you have this construction, but it isn't really used for anything other than holding up the roof in real life. And kind of using that opportunity to create a space is something I really enjoy. And I've done that for multiple builds before this one. I really love the idea of creating these incredible interior spaces that really don't need to do much more than inspire, and then still have space for all the practical stuff. And of course, being able to explore all parts of the build is always important to me. Especially the tower. Ultimately, I find the creative diversity in this space incredible, and there's merit to each approach. Skill isn't a scale, but a landscape, with many peaks and valleys, many ways to improve and many ways to fall short. Each of us bring a certain flavor to anything we're building, whether we like it or not. When painting, singing, or even building in Minecraft, everything is filtered through you and gets expressed in your own voice, so lean into that.